when I talk about 36 instead of 39, 1939 was when the war broke out. We can't know that, and I think we're years from a war with Russia. But 1936, rise of authoritarian powers in Europe, especially Italy and Germany, and the intervention in the Spanish Civil War by the Germans as almost a rehearsal for what happened. How far can they go? What can they get away with? What do their munitions do?
Right.
So I think if you want a historical analogy, I think 1936 is a better one. But I know what Tusk means. He means if Ukraine falls, it's a matter of time before we fight.
The Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, has warned that Europe is now in what he calls a pre-war era reminiscent of 1939. Mr. Tusk insisted that nobody on the continent would feel safe if Russia defeated Ukraine. His warning echoes those of neighbouring Baltic states who are worried about the consequences of Russia succeeding in its invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Putin says he has no plans to attack a NATO country. Well, joining me now is Tim Marshall, author and expert on foreign affairs and international diplomacy. Hello, Tim.
Afternoon.
Great to speak to you. Is Europe in a pre-war era reminiscent of 1939?
It's impossible to know if there's going to be a war, but you can see what Tusk is getting at. I think it's closer to 1936 than 1939, which I'll come back to. The background to this is really that there was a class of Western Europeans, and I differentiate between Eastern Europeans, an intellectual and political class, that instead in 1989 and then through the 90s and the following decade, instead of looking back at the last 2,000 years of European history, they just looked at their present and they mistook what was a holiday from history, a brief holiday from history, for the new norm. Whereas what is happening in Europe now is actually relatively normal. And I think that's what Tusk is getting to. And it had to come from an Eastern European because the Poles spend 4% of their GDP on defense. The Baltics all spend more than 2 points of their GDP. The Baltics have conscription. One of them just reintroduced it. The other two never got rid of it. So to come full circle, when I talk about 36 instead of 39, 1939 was when the war broke out. We can't know that, and I think we're years from a war with Russia. But 1936, rise of authoritarian powers in Europe, especially Italy and Germany, and the intervention in the Spanish Civil War by the Germans as almost a rehearsal for what happened. How far can they go? What can they get away with? What do their munitions do?
Right.
So I think if you want a historical analogy, I think 1936 is a better one. But I know what Tusk means. He means if Ukraine falls, it's a matter of time before we fight.
Well, if he's right, what does Putin want? Does he want to recreate Russia's borders from 30 years ago and reclaim those Baltic states, all of them?
Yes. A couple of months after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian Duma the parliament put up a new bill, and it didn't go through because they were busy. But the new bill was about scrapping the agreement that they had with Lithuania, that it was an independent country. End of the Cold War, breakup of what was in fact the Russian Empire, but it was called the Soviet Union. And Moscow agreed, yes, you are an independent country. They've never accepted it. They don't accept any of the Baltics as independent countries, and they think they should be controlled by Russia. And if they can do it, they will do it. So Putin's on record as saying he wants to, the end of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. And they want to recreate part of it. Now, I'm not saying it's because they're inherently aggressive, but inherently they believe in a sphere of influence, that this is their backyard and they have the right to control the peoples in it. And that, of course, is stopped by NATO membership. And so if Ukraine falls, if NATO was to fall apart, I think without question the Baltics are on the target list, as is Georgia, as is Moldova.
Yeah, but does, from a military perspective, does Russia have the power? It doesn't, does it, to take on NATO?
No, it doesn't. It is vastly inferior militarily.
So why would they do it?
Well, the scenario I'm giving you is that Ukraine loses one way or another, and then this is the next bit, that if Mr. Trump comes in and he does severely damage and weaken NATO, and it becomes what President Macron said it was, and he was wrong, but he said it was brain dead a few years ago. In these scenarios, at that point, if there's no NATO, there is no restraint on him moving against the Baltics and perhaps even further on. That's why when the potential next American president talks like this, it is so incredibly dangerous, because they will do it. Without question, the Russians would attempt to do this, and the only thing that stops them is NATO. No, but militarily, not even close to the power of NATO. But NATO without America, that's a different matter.
NATO is not going to lose America, though. I think even Trump himself has pulled back a little bit on those statements. And so the future of NATO is probably slightly more secure than we think. There was the big headlines that said, oh, make sure you pay your 2% of GDP to military spending. Actually, people around Europe, military spending in many countries is increasing, and Trump's not going to pull out, is he?
Probably not. I agree with you, but the danger is there, and also there are different ways to skin a cat. You don't, if they reduced the amount they paid in, if they didn't have a US commander as Saka, Supreme Commander Allied Forces Europe, there are different ways to weaken NATO. And I agree with you. I don't think it will happen, but those are the stakes that we're playing for. And you go back, every American president has complained about Europe not arming itself. Obama called us freeloaders. It's just that Mr. Trump has a certain manner, shall we say. But it's that plus the invasion of Ukraine, which has caused more countries than ever to rise above 2%. But more than half of them still don't spend that much. Poland spends 4%. Lithuania is 2.5, Latvia is 2.3, UK is just over 2%, but still most of them don't. And what Tusk is getting at is that we need to rearm, and we are actually. All the armaments factories are now reopening, but this is going to be a 5 to 10 year project. And in that time, what Tusk is arguing, and all the Eastern Europe, most of the Eastern Europeans are arguing, if you really don't want things to become much, much worse later on, help Ukraine now, because as we've seen, there's fatigue about arming them and about helping them. And it's a big year for NATO, for Ukraine, and for Russia.
Tim, always good to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time.